What's happening is when you put the square root of -9 in your calculator, you guys got error?
Yeah.
Did any of the calculators say non-real answer? Did any of them say that?
No, mine didn't. Mine didn't.
I think the TI-84s will say non-real answer. Okay.
Mine says error.
Error. Okay. Today we're going to explore imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers came from this problem here. How can I square root a negative number? There must be a way, and there is a way. It's called imaginary numbers. If you look at this next section, it just says story time. I'm going to play.
We can graph our function and get a nice parabola. Now, let's say we want to...
So we watched the video, and we talked about how imaginary numbers are on a whole different plane. It solved this problem of the square root of a negative number. It actually has a solution. Let's talk about the square root of -9. If I break down the square root of -9, I want to break this up a multiplication. I'm going to rewrite this as -1 times 9. Are we okay with that? -1 times 9 is -9. And I'm going to break it down one more time based off this new information. So this is really equivalent to the square root of -1. What's the square root of 9?
3.
3. And the square root of -1 is actually I. So what's happening here is I'm getting I times 3, or I could write it as 3I. And this is an imaginary number. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2. What happens to the roots? It's repeated multiplication, so it's squaring that square root.
That's negative.
So it's just 2.
Oh.
This is where our next I property comes from. Write down this I property. I squared equals -1. It's going to help us when we simplify expressions. Everybody with me so far? We're going to start by just trying to use I. I'm going to rewrite I to the third. How can I rewrite I to the third? What does it mean? I times itself 3 times. That's what I to the third means. It's an exponent. It's repeated multiplication. I'm going to rewrite it so that I squared comes out. I squared times I is I to the third, right?
Right.
What's I squared equivalent to? -1. So I to the third really simplifies to be negative I.
I squared times I squared.
Yeah, I squared times I squared. And those are both equal to -1 times -1. So I to the fourth is really equal to 1. Let's break down I to the fifth. I want I squareds to appear. I squared times I squared times I. I squareds are equal to -1 times -1 times I. -1 times -1 is just 1. What are we left with? I. Okay. In number 4, can you label these complex numbers? Complex numbers are when you have a real part and an imaginary part. So we'll do this first one together. I want to add the real parts together, so I'm combining like terms. What's -1 plus 3?
3 to 2.
That's my real part. 2i plus 5i.
Well, 5 equals.
2i plus 5i. 7i. 2 is the real part. 7i is the imaginary part. When you have a real and imaginary together, they're called complex. Let's try B.
All right.
Combine the real parts, combine the imaginary parts. This should look familiar to the first problem.
Let's do this.
Instead of I, we
-3
instead of x, we've got I this time.
plus literally just
-3
I
minus
squared,
6i.
right?
-3
Plus I
minus
squared.
6i. We haven't
Six?
multiplied. We haven't multiplied yet.
Wouldn't it be negative?
We're gonna need a box. We're gonna need a box. 3i 5 minus 4i. What's 3 times 5?
15.
What's 5 times I?
5i.
Great. What's 3 times a negative 4i?
Negative 12i.
And finally, the last box, a negative 4i times an I.
4. Negative 4i.
I squared. Let's rewrite this now. I've got 15 is the real part. How many i's should I have? Negative 7i. And I have a minus 4i squared. But what is I squared equal to? Negative 1. So I'm going to replace I squared with negative 1. What happens to my minus 4? Turns positive. So now I have a plus 4 and a 15. My final answer should be 19 minus 7i. Imaginary numbers. I is equivalent to the square root of negative 1. So when you ever square root and you've got a negative number under it, you can now write it in terms of I. I squared is equal to negative 1. And we talked about complex numbers. Complex numbers. They have a real part and they have an imaginary part. A represents the real. BI represents the imaginary part. We're going to talk about reducing roots. We did an example together. We're going to do another one here in a minute. Reducing roots. And this will come in handy tomorrow when we put this all together into the quadratic formula. So, for example, the square root of 9 we did earlier, we broke that down into negative 1 times 9. We broke that down further because once we get the square root of negative 1 by itself, that turns to I. The square root of 9 is actually 3. We can write our final answer as plus or minus 3i. So now we have an imaginary answer.
Molly, are you getting this?
I'm going to square root first. Oh no, I have a negative under the square root, but now we've got something to deal with that. So I'm going to break it up into negative 1 times 16. Do you agree with me that that's still negative 16? I'm going to break it down one more time.
Wait. Sorry, go ahead.
You're fine. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16. Is the square root of 16 a nice root? What are my options for the square root of 16?
4.
Or
Negative 4.
negative 4. And the square root of negative 1 is I. So my answer is plus or minus 4. What? I.
I think we can
Did on your calculator?
Is that right?
Sure.
3.464101.
Mathematically, it's not
We're not allowed to do that?
Wait, so
You're
I
fine.
is the square root
of negative 1. I is the square root of negative 1.
How's that even possible?
All right, we're solving. I want to get the x squared by itself. What should I do first?
Minus 15.
Minus 15 from both sides. 2x squared. Negative 35 minus 15 more. What's it going to be? A negative 50. I'm still trying to get the x squared by itself.
Divide 2.
Divide both sides by 2.
Why would it be negative 50? Oh, never mind. Yep.
How do I get rid of a square root?
You're gonna square it. You're gonna multiply, sorry.
Square root it?
You add I.
Oh, my bad. How do you get rid of a square? Power of 2.
That's what I said.
I know. I messed
Multiply
up.
by 2?
We're gonna square root both sides.
Did you answer 5 plus I?
It's
Plus or minus 5.
plus or minus 5i. We okay with that?
Yeah. You gotta give me a second to write this down.
Pause. Minus 5 from both sides. What should I undo next?
Bless you.
I'm trying to get x by itself. I'm solving by undoing. What would be the next thing I should undo? The square. So I'm going to square root both sides. Didn't we do the square root of 16 already? Negative 16? What is it?
3.4.
4.
Plus or minus 4i. What's my last step for getting x alone? I want to add 3 to both sides. So now my answer is a complex answer.
You can do the square root of the other side.
So this one's a complex answer. This one's imaginary because it only has an I term. This one has a real part and an I term part. Did you guys already start the homework?
No, I'm just looking at it.
We're doing 1A and B. We're gonna skip 2. And then will you cross off 3E and cross off 5? 3E? It's like I to the 100th. That's our homework.